In today's lesson, we're going to look at what happens when we have more intersecting lines. Well, if we have more intersecting lines, we have more transversals, which means we create more angles. If we look at our first examples, we're going to assume that L is parallel to M and S is parallel to T. So I'm going to label those lines parallel. But I need to distinguish S and T from L and M, so I'm going to use two arrowheads on S and T. If you look at this diagram, we've really created 16 different angles. Label those 16 different angles. Let's look at our first pair of angles. Angle 1 and angle 13. Angle 1 and angle 13 are both on line S. So S is my transversal between 1 and 13, and my parallel lines are L and M. 1 is in the upper left corner, and 13 is in the upper left corner. So 1 and 13 are corresponding. And since L and M are parallel, my corresponding angles are going to be congruent. Let's look at angles 1 and 5. 1 and 5 are both on line L, which means my transversal between 1 and 5 is L, and my parallel lines are now S and T. And 1 is in the upper left corner, and 5 is in the upper left corner. So those two angles are corresponding. And since they're corresponding angles between two parallel lines, they're going to be congruent. So how can angle 1 be corresponding to two different angles? Well, if you look, depending on which transversal I'm on, 1 can be corresponding to two different angles. On transversal S, it corresponds to 13, and on transversal L, it corresponds to 5. Let's look at angles 3 and 13. 3 and 13 are both on transversal S, and they're on opposite sides of transversal S. So they alternate, and they're between my two parallel lines L and M, so they have to be interior angles. And since L and M are parallel, my alternate interior angles will be congruent. 3 and 5. My transversal is now L, and my parallel lines are S and T. And 3 and 5 are on opposite sides of my transversal, which means they alternate. And they're between my parallel lines, which means that they are interior. Again, 3 can be an alternate interior angle with different angles depending on what transversal I'm on. 3 and 5 are alternate interior angles between parallel lines. They're going to be congruent. If I look at 1 and 15, 1 and 15 are both on transversal S, and they're on opposite sides of S, so they're alternate. And they're outside of my parallel lines L and M, so they are exterior angles. And since L and M are parallel to each other, my alternate exterior angles are going to be congruent. Now let's look at 15 and 9. 15 and 9 are both on transversal M with parallel lines S and T. And 15 and 9 are on opposite sides of my transversal, so they are alternate. And if I look, 15 and 9 are actually between S and T. So 15 and 9 have to be interior. And since they're alternate interior angles between two parallel lines, they have to be congruent. So how can angle 15 and angle 15 be exterior one time and interior another time? Well, if I look at 15, 15 is exterior of L and M, it's outside of L and M, and it's in between S and T. So depending on what transversal I have, that's going to determine my parallel lines, and that's going to determine if 15 is going to be interior or exterior. 3 and 16. My transversal is S, and they're between my parallel lines L and M, so they're going to be interior, but they're on the same side of my transversal, so they are consecutive interior angles. And they're consecutive interior angles between parallel lines, which means that they're going to be supplementary. Last pair of angles, 1 and 9. 1 and 9 are both in the upper left corners, so it looks like they should be corresponding. But there is no transversal between 1 and 9. So 1 and 9 actually don't have a name. I can conclude something about 1 and 9, but I'd have to write a little proof. 1 and 13 are corresponding, which means that they are congruent. 9 and 13 are corresponding, which means that they are congruent. And if 1 is congruent to 13, and 9 is congruent to 13, by the transitive property, 1 and 9 are going to be congruent. So 1 and 9 are congruent, we just don't have a name for 1 and 9. Let's look at an example that involves algebra. In order to solve for A, I need to set up an equation. To set up an equation, I need to use my geometry to figure out how the angles that involve A are related to each other. This angle and this angle both have an A in them. They are on transversal Z, and I have parallel lines W and X. This angle is above Z and this angle is below, so they are alternate exterior angles. And since my lines are parallel, my alternate exterior angles are going to be congruent. To set up my equation to solve for A, I need to make these angles equal to each other. Once I have my equation set up to solve for A, I just use algebra. So how big is this angle? Well, it's 2A's minus 6. So it's 2 74s minus 6. 2 74s minus 6. So this angle right here is 142 degrees. To figure out this angle is A plus 68. So I'm going to take 74 and add 68. If you notice, I get the same answer both times. Plugging my value for A back into my angles is a great way to check my answers. To solve for B, I need to look at how the angles that involve B relate to each other. Well, these two angles are both on transversal W, and they're both between parallel lines Y and Z. If I look at these two angles, they're on the same side of my transversal, and they're between. So they are consecutive interior angles. And consecutive interior angles are supplementary. So to solve for B, the equation that I'm going to set up this time is taking both of my angles and adding them together, and for an answer getting 180 degrees. This angle plus this angle are going to be supplementary. Once my equation is set up, solve for B. Collect like terms. And solve for B. Again, I can check this answer by plugging this number in for B. Well, this angle right here is going to be 38 degrees. And this angle is going to be 4 B's minus 10. It's going to be 4 38s minus 10. 4 times 38 minus 10. So this angle is 142 degrees. If you look, these two angles are alternate interior angles, so they have to be congruent, and they are. These two angles have to be supplementary. 38 and 142. Yeah, they're supplementary. And these two angles have to be supplementary, and they are. Plugging your values back in and checking to make sure it makes sense in your diagram is a great way to check your answers.